It seems like we have the Woodstock Brigade here. The class is tilting definitely in the seniors' direction. Not that I'm an ageist. I'm just making an observation here. Not sure how to account for that fact. I used to have quite a following among young people. But maybe you are the new youth relative to me. I'm not sure. So, where we left off in the last class, we were looking at what are the premises of Mill's argument for liberty of speech. And he lays out, scattered in the book, not sequentially, he lays out some claims about the value or the virtue of liberty of speech. Where we left off in last class was Mr. Mill's claim that mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than by compelling each to live as seems good to the rest, which is simply to say that we all benefit. Now there has been a drastic reduction in the age and the mean, or is it, yeah, the mean, as a result of Albert's miraculous entry into the class. And basically what he was saying is that we all gain as a society when we allow people to pursue what they think seems best for themselves than trying to impose on them what we think is best for them. And I must say, since we have the Woodstock Brigade among us, that was, in my generation, I have to say, one of the virtues of growing up at that time. Because I vividly recall that when we went off to college, parents never asked their kids, what are you going to major in? And certainly, it would have been considered an outrage if a parent were to instruct his or her child as to what he or she should major in. It was really, I would say, unthinkable that a parent would compel their child to major in one area as against another, because in the parent's judgment, that was what was the best for the child or good for the child. It never happened. I could say with absolute certitude that my parents hadn't a clue what either I or my siblings majored in. It was never even thought to be their business, although not significantly, because schools were much cheaper back then, but somewhat they were footing the bill. So they had title to ask us, but it never occurred to them because of the basic Mill principle that people had internalized, namely, the child, or in this case, the student, was the best judge of what was in his or her best interest. Things have radically changed in the new generations, the ones to which just a small number of people in the class belong, I would say Ethan and Albert. Yes, and Lisa.
Elise. Close.
What? What do you mean close?
Elise.
Elise. That to me is Lisa. It's the same thing.
Am I not too old to belong to this class?
What?
Am I not too old? You belong to that group anymore?
You, Yella?
Yeah. Apparently not. Okay.
You graduated already.
I guess so.
Yeah. There have been various reasons, but the main reason why parents have a huge say now is because the tuitions have gone up so much, and parents tell their kids in a very matter-of-fact way, if you want to major in sociology because you think that's in your best interest, then you pay for it. But if you want me to pay for it, then you're majoring in business. Now, it's also true that
It's also because college degrees aren't that worth it.
excuse me?
It's also because college degrees aren't worth as much. Like, it's much harder, like, a degree it means a lot less.
I don't think that's really true. I think that it's still a gateway. If you don't have that college degree, you are disqualified from many, many jobs. And the truth be told, it wasn't worth all that much in my day. I don't think. The depreciation of the college degree set in when the public school education radically deteriorated, and basically a college education is what most people used to get up until junior high school. Kids enter college pretty close to illiterate nowadays, I would say, both in math and in the math, science, and the humanities. So college degree basically meant the same thing in terms of accumulation of knowledge, what a previous generation got in high school. It's,
Do you think that across the board? I mean, I'm thinking of a place like Carnegie.
no, you are correct. There is, and I was going to qualify my remark, I decided not to. It is true that in the elite schools, the standards are much higher than in my day. I had the fortune of spending a Friday evening with a modern Orthodox Jewish family in the Upper East Side. They have 5 boys. They attend a very good Jewish day school. And the 18-year-old, he was already functioning, I think probably, the 18-year-old, he's a senior in high school. He was probably already functioning at the level of graduate school. So there's been, just like a huge chasm has opened up in income between the 1% and the 99%, a huge chasm has opened up in terms of education between what the 1% are doing in school and what the 99% aren't doing in school. So yes, it's a differentiated picture, but I was talking mostly about the 99%. But I have noticed I remember when I was teaching in the 1990s in NYU, which was quite expensive already back then, and I remember many students said that their parents chose their major, which was an absolute shock to me. It was such an alien idea that what you were going to do with your life was going to be determined by your parent and not by yourself. 2 comments and then we'll move on, yes?
Oh, no, just throw this out there. I know from my own personal experience, the parents that were doing what you were talking about, which was just having no say over their children at all, were doing it because they were clueless. I grew up in a neighborhood in Brooklyn that was basically, an old-fashioned poor Italian neighborhood. And people don't think of poor Italian neighborhoods, but they existed back then. Their parents had no clue what goes on in college. And even a lot of the Jewish families, if they weren't wealthy and stuff, they had no clue. So they didn't choose a major because they didn't have any idea. What shocked me sometimes is when I met kids whose parents weren't choosing a major, but were advising them and were kind of hip to what was going on, was because they had some college.
That's a fair argument, which frankly hadn't occurred to me. I would say, though, it was odd that there was no interest shown in the child's major. It was just assumed the child chose what the child was interested in, and it wasn't anyone else's business. As I said, my parents are quite well educated, but they never asked. I don't have any recollection. I doubt they ever knew what I majored in. It was just thought that it was your business and not theirs. But it's also true what you say. Maybe some large number of his parents perhaps didn't even have a concept of a major, what it meant. Yes?
Well, so the only thing I would add is my parents were both highly educated, and they never asked me what I was going to major in. All my children went to college. I never asked what they were going to major in. But I think one of the reasons there's this huge emphasis on what are you going to major in so you can get a job is there's such a vast discrepancy in wealth, and those rungs don't exist anymore, and there used to actually be rungs.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. One of the reasons parents are anxious about their children's major is because there aren't jobs out there. And so there's a real fear that the child will choose a major which won't end up with gainful employment. And that's a real fear. In my day, I could tell you, I have pretty vivid and pretty good long-term memory. I don't remember anyone ever in college ever discussing what we're going to do when we get out. We never talked about it. The assumption was you would decide what you want to do, and whatever you want to do, there would be a job in your field.
And there was.
And there was. Actually, I think that's the other side. That was a rational calculation. There was. People just, whenever they were ready, I want to be in publishing. I want to be, there's only one major the only major which was different was pre-med. Because pre-med you had to start in freshman year taking the bio and the chem, the organic, the inorganic. It was a very defined sequence. If you wanted to go to medical school, you had to start freshman year, first semester. Other than that, yes, whenever you were ready, you decide what you wanted to do, there were the jobs. I think that Yella had made the suggestion last week that we'll appoint somebody to be the roving Mike. That means he or she will take responsibility for bringing the mic to the person who raises his or her hand. Who would like to be the roving Mike for today's class? Everybody will eventually have to do it because I strongly believe that you have to share feces labor, feces work. So you are the roving Mike for today's class, and you will get at the end of the class a signature from me. Not a signed book, which is a little bit, I think, steep. But yes, I think that was the other fact. There always were jobs. So still, I do think a certain element of freedom has been lost in recent generations, but mostly I think it's owing to the state of the economy rather than any lurking totalitarianism by parents. Now, Mill makes a couple of other arguments for the virtue of liberty of speech and liberty of conduct. We'll look at a couple of them before we get to the heart of Mill's argument. So, how about if we go to, can our computer whiz, Yella Brunsima, go to preponderance? Good. Yella, you did it on the first draw. That's very impressive. So, why is it then, who would like to read it? We should have for each class, we're going to have for each class a reader. And for this class, let it be Ethan. because he's already demonstrated his virtuosity when it comes to reading. You have to use the microphone, Ethan. Why is it then
that there is on the whole a preponderance among mankind of rational opinions and rational conduct? If there really is this preponderance, which there must be, unless human affairs are, and have always been, in an almost desperate state, it is owing to a quality of the human mind, the source of everything respectable in man, either as an intellectual or as a moral being, namely, that his errors are corrigible.
corrigible means correctable?
He is capable of rectifying his mistakes by discussion and experience, not by experience alone. There must be discussion to show how experience is to be interpreted. Wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument, but facts and arguments, to produce any effect on the mind, must be brought before it. Very few facts are able to tell their own story without comments to bring out their meaning. The whole strength and value, then, of human judgment, depending on the one property that can be set right when it is wrong.
That can be set right.
No, that it can be set right when it is wrong. Reliance can be placed on it only when the means of setting it right are kept constantly at hand.
Good. So, Mill is making an
Let
argument.
me just ask, does it help if I highlight the text, or does it make it more difficult to read?
I think it helps.
Yeah?
I mean,
Thank you for that query. I think you're being a little presumptuous in your role. I should have been the one asking that question. Yella slowly but surely is trying to usurp my role in class. I've seen it happen before with these young whippersnappers, but I'm quite capable of putting him in his place when the moment requires it. So, Mill is making an argument here, and the argument goes something like this. The fact of the matter is, most of our behavior, a preponderance of our behavior, not all of it, but a preponderance of our behavior each day, each week, and each year, and over a lifetime of an individual and also of society as a whole, it's preponderantly rational behavior. If it were not rational behavior, basically we would be living in chaos. And so he asks himself the question, how did it come to pass that we basically function in a rational way? Not totally, but preponderantly. And Mill says, the reason why we function basically in a preponderant way is because we as human beings have the capacity for correcting our errors. We do something wrong and then, or something irrational, let's not call it wrong for a moment, let's call it irrational. We do something irrational and then through experience, what's sometimes called trial and error, through experience and, Mill critically or crucially says, through discussion of that experience, weighing, okay, we have to evaluate something went wrong. What went wrong? Mill says it's not enough. Experience in and of itself does not lead you to a right conclusion. Experience can lead to multiple conclusions. He says what's required for experience to correct your error, to rectify your error, what's required is that you have discussion and debate to evaluate the experience. What went wrong? What went right? And it's through this discussion and debate that human beings gradually discard or leave behind irrational behavior and conduct themselves in a rational fashion. So now let me reread the passage, and it should be clear to you from what I said exactly what Mill is trying to say here. Why is it then there is on the whole a preponderance among mankind of rational opinions and rational conduct? If there really is this preponderance, which there must be, unless human affairs are and have always been in an almost desperate state. It is owing to a quality of the human mind, the quality that is the source of everything respectable in man, either as an intellectual or as a moral being, namely, that his errors are corrigible, are correctable. He is capable of rectifying his mistakes by discussion and experience, not by experience alone. There must be discussion to show how experience is to be interpreted. Wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument. I want you to underline in your minds, because that's the statement I want to home in on, his claim that the way we become more rational and less rational, more moral and less immoral, he says is basically the wrong ideas, the irrational ideas, the wrong practices, the irrational practices, they gradually yield to fact and argument. But facts and arguments, to produce any effect on the mind, must be brought before it. Very few facts are able to tell their own story without comments to bring out their meaning. In order to understand a situation, it's not enough just to state facts. You have to have debate and discussion about the meanings of those facts. The whole strength and value then of human judgment, if human beings are rational overall or preponderantly, depending on that one property, that our judgment can be set right when it is wrong. Reliance can be placed on it, human judgment, only when the means setting it right, namely discussion based on facts and arguments, are kept constantly at hand. I know often it's, people say, what are the lessons to learn from the Nazi Holocaust? And whenever that question is posed, I always point out that different people came away with radically different lessons. The idea that an experience itself determines the lesson, the rational conclusion, is not supported by any close look at any historical experience. Some Jews came out of the Nazi Holocaust with the conclusion, never again to Jews. That was their conclusion was, nobody cared about us during World War II, and henceforth we're not going to stay up nights worrying about others. We have to look after ourselves. That's what some people walked away with, and others walked away with the conclusion, never again to anyone. It was wrong what was done to us, and therefore we should be vigilant that it's not done to anyone else. Those are two very radically different conclusions that are drawn from the same experience. So experience in itself, I think Mill is right here, as he's mostly right. Experience itself doesn't determine any particular lesson or any particular right lesson. It requires debate, discussion, to figure out what lessons are to be learned. What I have a problem with is Mill's conception of how progress occurs, how we become more rational and more moral over time, and less irrational and less immoral over time. Mill has a kind of a very, I guess you would call it, idealistic view of how human progress occurs. Wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument. So the question I would pose to you is very simple, because we have people here who have rich life experience. Some of you go back to the emancipation of the slaves. Some of you go back to women getting the right to vote. Some of you go back to the civil rights era. Some of you go back to what was called back then the women's liberation era, and everybody here has passed through the age where gay rights, gay marriage, and those sorts of rational behaviors eventually came to predominate over irrational behaviors, at least in some people's opinion. The Supreme Court may soon decide differently, but for the moment. The question is that how change occurred? Was it that our society was gradually convinced that slavery was wrong and that's how it was ended? Was society gradually convinced that the subjection of women was wrong and that's how it ended? Is that how our society evolved and unfolded on an ever higher level? Is that what happened? To quote Mill, wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument. Is that how it happened? How does it happen? You've lived through it. How did, your name is? Over here. No, don't turn your head. Hi. No, here, yeah. Terry. So you lived through several eras of the transformation of women in our society. And my guess is that you were a participant and not just a bystander in that process. I could be wrong, it's just an intuition, but that would be my guess. Is that how women's rights were acquired? Wrong opinions and practices gradually yielded to fact and argument? Is that what happened?
I would agree with part of that. Yeah.
I'm a little skeptical because, let me give you my point of view and then you'll answer me. It's not as if the women's emancipation movement came up with novel new arguments or facts. Those arguments have been around for centuries, if not millennia. Same thing with the wrongness of slavery. The arguments had been around since the time of Spartacus. But only at a certain moment did the situation radically change. Was it because of fact and argument prevailing over wrong opinions? You experienced it. How did women make gains in the 1960s? Was it at heart an intellectual undertaking? Or was it more about political power, ripe conditions, and I'm not sure. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of the civil rights movement where people suddenly had this epiphany that discrimination against black people was wrong. I'm not even convinced that arguments had much to do with it. I think it had a lot more to do with a kind of intuition that inequality was wrong. I don't think it was about facts and argument. It's wrong to deny a person the right to sit at a Woolworth's counter and order a hamburger because he or she is black. I don't know how much that had to do with facts and arguments. What do you think?
Well, in my generation, a lot of what I felt was taught to me at home by my parents, and I would hear them talk over the table of what was right and wrong, and they were immigrant people, and they infused us, myself and my siblings, with the idea that in America you really had to fight for yourself, and you had to be assertive, and you had to go ahead and really make a statement to promote yourself. And I grew up in that kind of an atmosphere, and in my generation, I mean, it was really a lot easier than what our 3 sons are going through right now, who are grown young men and working, fortunately. But it was such a different time. And
But how much do you feel? How much do you feel? You know, I could be wrong. I have very mixed memories and mixed opinions on this. How much do you think that? How much of social progress has been due to facts and argument trumping wrong opinions? Mill lays it out like it's a rational discussion. Oh, you believe in slavery. I don't believe in slavery. Here are my reasons for not believing in slavery. And then the person who believes in slavery says, well, you know what? I'm convinced. Your arguments and facts are stronger than my own. You believe that women shouldn't have the right to vote. I think women should have the right to vote. Here are my arguments. You lay out your arguments and your facts. And then the person who doesn't believe it says, well, you know what? That's a very strong argument. I'm convinced they should have the right to vote. That's how Mill depicts it. Wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument. Is that really what happens in the real world? Now, I could be wrong, and please don't be swayed by
I think it's an effect. It's a minor effect. I think that has a minor effect, and some people do that. There are moral people. The issue with being moral is that it's not easy. I mean, I've always had an opinion that every human being in the world at some point in their life decided they were going to be a really great person. And some of these people are the worst people in the world because they gave it such a genuine effort, got so frustrated, they're now worse than they were when they just didn't care. There's self-interest and just whatever they call it, geopolitical change, and you know, the whole civil rights. I worked for the Transit Authority for 33 years, and I was involved with the union. We studied railroad history and stuff like that. A lot of the civil rights was in the unions. One of the big breakthroughs goes back to when they had coal, and they used to shovel coal from one car into the locomotive with these really long handles.
Yeah, I remember.
And these people that did it were comparable to NFL players and NBA players. You had to be a brute, not just a big tough guy, but special. And they would take you anywhere. You might be in Texas in the hottest weather, and 2 months later you might be in Utah at 40 degrees below zero, and it was a brutal, brutal job. And then and it was all black. And then they invented this machine that fed it. And now they had a little compartment. So the white guys wanted to take the whole thing over. And they were taking it over, and the union was supporting it, and management was supporting it. And the blacks said, you know, every single time you guys go on strike, every single time you guys have a problem, and we scab, and you always have something to say, but here's your chance to do something. You want our porters to go on strike with you? You want us to, you know, stand, and don't forget, they were going to get the firemen on their side. These were like Lawrence Taylors. They were going to stand on the line with the white guys. It doesn't matter if there's 50 other black guys there. If you got one Lawrence Taylor, black guy in your side, he's going to help a lot. And that was a huge change. The union said, no, you know what? We're going to let them keep their jobs.
Well, I want to just...
But that was all self-interest.
Yeah, I want to just summarize what you just did. The argument, your name is?
Joseph.
Joseph's argument is straightforward. He's saying that self-interest can account much more for social change than rational argument and facts and argument. Is that true? Yella, you had your hand up?
No, that wasn't about something else.
Yes?
Wait, what?
My name is Bob. And
Bob?
Bob.
B-O-B.
B.O.B..
Okay.
I think it's environmental, social environmental. When you are growing up in a family, you usually come out the doors of those families with the opinions that the parents and brothers and sisters, they generally have. It's when you see a map, it can be of the United States, you can find out which are the conservative states and districts, and it's a polyglot map. It's always environmental. It is, you're overwhelmed by the opinions around you. Sometimes they dominate you, sometimes they don't, but it's coming from the outside and convincing you that, not usually by argument. I don't remember that ever happening very much, but
I think it's a mixed picture. His point, it's an interesting point. He says you can know a person's opinions simply by looking at where they are on the map. You have red states and you have blue states, and has very little to do with arguments. It just has to do where you happen to be situated. That's going to tell you a lot more about a person's opinions than his or her facts and argument. Yes. On the other hand, just to play, because I'm actually very torn on this particular topic, it makes education so to speak, a waste of time. If you discover that in politics, facts have no persuasive power, then why are you studying, and why are you reading, and why are you trying to convince people with facts if in fact facts have so little, as I said, persuasive power in trying to change attitudes? I was watching over the weekend, just briefly, not intensively. For some reason, I ended up looking at some of Malcolm X's speeches, and it was quite telling that what made Malcolm X, he was a very effective orator, no question about it, but the oratory was in the service of a very shrewd mind. He was making, whether you agree with him or not, and I wish he didn't begin every statement with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, but then there are other thinkers in the world who begin their statements with Allah, but then they quickly get past, you quickly get past sort of the required preface, the required preliminaries, and then he made persuasive arguments. I don't think, personally, that he would have had the persuasive power that he did merely on the basis of his being black, handsome for sure, and just in his manner of expression, it was impressive, no question about it. He knew it, the audience knew it, this guy knew how to talk. But I don't think, in the absence of the content, that is to say, the facts and arguments, I do not believe, in the absence of the content, he would have been as compelling and persuasive a speaker. And in the same way, though obviously of a totally different genre, what makes Professor Chomsky, when he speaks, he is deliberately, he tells it, he's deliberately dull. He says, I purposely speak in a monotone. I purposely avoid any kind of pyrotechnics, the fireworks. He says he wants to hone in just on the mind. He wants to convince rationally in the Millian spirit of facts and argument. And I don't think it's possible to argue that well, maybe it is, I mean, I'd have to hear you, but I think a large amount of his persuasive power comes from the facts and argument. There is a reverse argument, which I'm willing to entertain, which is people walk in wanting to agree with him, and what makes him so persuasive is that he supplies the facts and the arguments which people want to hear but don't know for themselves. That they already believe X, Y, and Z, but they don't quite know how to rationally defend their positions. It's an intuition that this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong, this is right, but they don't really have the intellectual armor to defend their positions. And so Chomsky's persuasive power isn't so much persuading as filling in the intellectual gaps in the intuitions that people already have, in which case it's not really wrong opinions and practices gradually yielding to facts and arguments. It's facts and arguments being provided for opinions which pre-existed his speaking. Now, I don't know. As I said, I don't want to believe that, because it then means most of my activity that I invested in my adult life was a waste and a charade. I was fooling myself into believing that I was convincing people, whereas it was just my charisma. Cecilia, you're supposed to be laughing at that. So we'll just take a few more comments on that. Let's go around the room. Let's start with Albert.
I think that kind of problem comes in when you put like a sharp, well, I'm not saying you're exactly doing this, but when you put a dichotomy between like our rational and our emotional side. So when you appeal to our emotional side, you're actually, the rational is just filling the details. It's not like the significant part. I think it's a lot more messy than that. It's more mixed. And like, I think we come across a lot of conceptual problems when we say that, oh, are we really convincing someone rationally rather than emotionally? But then I don't really think one can possibly say it's one or the other. So I'm not really sure.
Okay, Albert, I'm going to just ask you to weigh in. Do you think Mill's description of the process is adequate?
No.
No. It's a disappointment to have to say that, because Mill's a very smart guy. And I'm very sad. No, I am. I'm disappointed I have to say no. This is an inadequate description of how we become rational or moral creatures. Okay, Efrat?
Along kind of the same lines, I think maybe there's a way to save his words, because even though he's saying the wrong deeds yield to the facts and arguments, but maybe there's other things on the way before they yield. There's other stuff that's, I think we can talk about it forever, but we don't really know what makes us change our minds. And what you said, things do change sometimes, not much, but somehow some alchemy causes change, and that alchemy is probably a combination of things. For me, I know very personally, sometimes there's a thought comes up to my mind about something I'm going to do, and another side says, "You crazy? No." And then it takes about 2 years for that thought to come up about 4 more times. All of a sudden, after 2 years, I'm there. And I say, wow, I used to think that's totally crazy. So now I know when something comes up and I say it's crazy, I'm like, okay, give it 2 years and you're there, so you can just shorten the process. But I think maybe some kind of the same thing. These arguments were there, but there was some kind of, it's kind of contradicting to say maturity and alchemy at the same time. But there was a moment where you can talk to me for 2 hours, but you know that moment where I go, oh, you know what? I don't know what. I listen, all of a sudden I hear it, all of a sudden I understand it.
No, I totally get what you're saying. And
Anything
I
that's
mean,
same
basically,
thing,
what
so-
Ephraim's saying is, at a certain moment in time, an idea which you've heard 10,000 times before, it suddenly resonates for you, and it says, you know what, that's true, and it then becomes part of your being. That's what happened with me and John Stuart Mill. I mean, I had heard arguments for freedom of speech from the beginning of grade school. I didn't believe them. I thought there were some people who possessed the truth, and others are idiots. And if you agreed with me, you have truth, and if you don't, you're an idiot. I kept to that view for a very long time, and then certain things happened, certain experiences, political experiences, and then when I read Mill, I realized, you know what, he's right. The arguments are elementary, but they're right. So, but I don't really think, did my wrong opinions yield to fact and argument? I would have to think that through. I can't answer that, but I certainly understand what you're saying because that was my own experience in life. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we could add some things to this discussion. I think self-interest, as Joseph said, plays a role. One question we have to ask, I think, when we, or Professor Chomsky or Malcolm X, try to persuade, who is the audience? Chomsky's audience is not, he's not trying to speak to CEOs. Malcolm X was first and foremost trying to speak to the black masses, trying to convince them of the wrong of their own situation, and try to inspire them, give them faith that change is possible and how it's possible.
Okay, I want to just stop you. I want to hear you out. We're going to go through it step by step. So I'm going to just interject, but you're going to continue. So Chomsky and Malcolm X, they're basically giving intellectual substance to predetermined opinions. Isn't that correct?
I'm not sure if I would call it opinion, but at least a moral core that is maybe dormant, you could say, that a lot of people recognize, but have come to live with, have come to justify in their own minds in order to live with their situation. And these arguments, you could say in a sense, awaken them. But
you know, Yella, I know Yella for a very long time, and Yella is one of, he is a conscript in Chomsky's army. You have to sort of be, you have to be truthful and honest with yourself. Did Chomsky change your opinions? My recollection is you considered yourself a radical long before you read Chomsky. What he did was he gave you arguments in support of your opinions. So it was not a process of wrong opinions and practices gradually yielding to fact and argument. That's just not what happened in your case.
No, I agree. But the point I was trying to make is the second part of it. I think Joseph gave a good example of that. Mm-hmm. When these black workers stood up for themselves based on this opinion, let's call it that, and forced the white workers to deal with that situation, forced them to deal with that argument, only at that point did it become sort of a debate. Before that, they weren't interested. They were forced to deal with that situation. And that's the same with a lot of women's struggles and so on and so forth.
But when
then you come back to the self-interest when it's against, when you make the cost so high that it's against the self-interest of the oppressor or the person with a certain amount of power to stick with the status quo. That's when change can happen. But last point attached to that, I think such things only happen when the demand does have a certain basis in, I don't know how you would call it, a certain moral core. There has to be a certain truth and rationality behind that argument that most humans somewhere deep down see that this is wrong.
When you say most humans see deep down it's wrong, who are you referring to now?
Most humans. But
Did
it's a very hard argument to
most
make.
men see that it was wrong that women were denied equality of rights in our society? Is that how women got their rights? Is that how it happened? I don't think that's how it happened.
So it was dormant, and then the conflict
It had
made
to
it.
be forced view.
I don't know. I want to just give some other people who didn't speak. Ethan? How do you think change occurs? Moral change, political change, society's progress, evolution. How does it change? Is it the process that Mill describes?
So,
And don't be afraid to take Mill's side because we are now trashing him. You know, you should find the courage to say, you know what, I think he's right. That's basically what happens. People see they're wrong.
it sort of depends on how you interpret gradually yield, right? Like, I think in the sense that you described it before, if you interpret like, are people really convinced in the moment by like some new argument to change their mind?
I think the gradually yield, if you just allow me, he's talking about a process of chipping away. You keep chipping away at an argument to show it's not right. What you're saying is not right. It's not right for this reason. It's not right for that reason. It's not right for this reason. It's not right for that reason. You chip away until the wrong argument gradually yields. I mean, that's the idealized intellectual process until your rational faculty can no longer sustain your wrong opinion. And you throw up your arms in despair and you say, you know what? I'm wrong. I admit it. I'm wrong. You've convinced me. And sometimes we all had that moment where you say, you convinced me. And that's how he says it happens in terms of human progress. Does that sound right to you?
So I think it does not sound right in the sense that like it doesn't really apply, like for an individual, right? It's not like every individual person, like slowly their opinion is changed over time. But if you look maybe collectively at everyone, it's like what formed their sort of contrary opinion in the first place can get weaker over time. Right. So, and then eventually you get to a point where, right, like you're close enough to the new opinion being the majority that like, and there's some conflict, like you can force people who are like just over to one edge to move to the other side, right? So it's like, it's not that there are always going to be people who are never going to be convinced, right?
Correct.
So
That
individually,
hardcore.
you're not chipping away at anything, right? But eventually, you know, those people are going to have kids, there's going to be new people, and like the strength of the argument that originally convinced those people, right, it might be weaker now because alternative arguments have been presented and are more, and it's slowly being chipped away in that sense. So like as time passes, right, like that seems more like what happens, right? Like
Mill's argument, a classic example of it, in all of its ludicrousness, by the way, was, as some of you remember, in Barack Obama's first term of office, he was against gay marriage. It's forgotten now, but he opposed it. Then came the 2012 election. He needed money. And where does Obama get money? Of course, he gets it from Hollywood. And Hollywood had very definite opinions about gay marriage. And so he meets with Dave Geffen and the other Hollywood moguls, and they said, you're not getting money unless you come on board. So what does Obama do? Because he's a supreme fraud. He says, I had a talk with my daughter, Malia. How many people remember this? I had a talk with Malia, who's, I guess, at that point, she's about 16 years old. And bear in mind, he was a professor of constitutional law at University of Chicago. So he knew something about the law before this conversation with Malia. I think her name is Malia or Malia, how do you pronounce it? What? Malia. And he says, she convinced me that my position was wrong and gay marriage was right. And of course, then the money came rolling in from Hollywood for his campaign. So, was it facts and argument gradually forcing wrong opinion to yield, or was it self-interest?
So I think that's self-interest, right? Obviously that's the point. But just because it's there's components of all of them, right? Like self-interest exists at the moment, right? When you flip from one to the other, but it doesn't have enough power by itself unless there's like a bunch of people who have already been convinced, right? So in that, like if everyone was like a hardliner of believing something, like it wouldn't really matter because they would just be devoted to believing it. But if there are people who don't really believe it, but just believe it publicly or right, then like it's easier for them, like self-interest like substitutes and like will push people who are like close to being able to move to the other side right?
Yeah, I understand. Everyone understands what Ethan is saying. Basically, Ethan is saying that facts and argument can carry the day if you're on the line. You haven't decided one way or the other. You could go this way or that way. In those situations, facts can carry the day. But when you already have a position, facts and argument aren't going to be very persuasive. So it's just when you are undecided that facts and argument have an influence, an impact on which way you go. I'm trying to think. Yella's position is, well, you have a dormant moral sense that's awakened. Honestly speaking, Yella, do you think Obama's dormant moral sense was awakened? Or Obama needed money, first of all, and second of all, polls were showing that most of the public would support it, so it's not going to hurt him electorally. It was it's one of those fascinating moments which hasn't been studied at all. It's a great PhD thesis for those of you who are contemplating writing your doctoral dissertation. 15 years ago, remember, it was Bill Clinton who put forth the Defense of Marriage Act. He was our liberal president, and he passed, it was him, the Defense of Marriage Act. And he did it because Clinton is a very shrewd politician. He knew where public opinion was, and he wanted to be reelected. How did it come to pass that in just about a decade, public opinion radically changed? And then the polls were showing 60% of Americans supported gay marriage. How did that happen? Did it have much to do with facts and argument trumping wrong opinions? Is that what happened? I don't know. I'll confess, I don't know. But I'm kind of skeptical that that's what happened. What I think happened, and it's purely speculative, not based on any serious study of the topic, you take somebody like Dick Cheney, who's a dyed-in-the-wool Neanderthal conservative, very conservative Mr. Cheney. And then Cheney comes out in favor of gay marriage. Why? His daughter is gay. And he tells the story, because I read his memoir. He tells the story that he's at an airport one day. His daughter meets him at the airport, and she tells him. And then he says, I hugged her and told her, it's okay, I love you. Now, when I first read that, I said, that's BS. We're talking about Dick Cheney. It's like, get out of my life, you fill in the blank. But then I thought, maybe it was true because it looked like they have a very warm family. You know, you can be a Neanderthal politically and still have it. You can have a warm family. They seem to be a pretty together family. So it was, I think, a lot more about the fact that people were discovering that a lot of their relatives, including in their immediate family, were confronted with this situation. And you have to choose between love and losing your son, daughter, niece, nephew, and so forth. And they chose love. It had very little to do with facts.
Did it matter how much of those opinions were already in the air?
Excuse me?
Did it matter how much of those opinions were already in the air?
Wait, let's just go around, but I'm not sure what you're saying there.
What the others?
Yeah. Go ahead. Well, I would like to hear, because you two are a little silent, and you should join. You can't just do the yeoman's work of passing the microphone. Yeah, you have life experience, and you've seen our society evolve from what's, in Mill's terms, some irrational to rational behavior and morals. What part do you think facts and argument played in that evolution?
I think that it was mostly political power, coercion at times, sometimes very serious coercion. And really this whole idea of facts is something that I think needs to be focused on a lot more carefully. What is it exactly is a fact, and how is it determined? Okay.
Well, let's just be clear.
One fact be interpreted differently from one group to another.
We have to be fair to Mill's text. He is clear on that. He says, very few facts are able to tell their own story without comments to bring out their meaning. So it's not just the fact, it's a whole argument built around the fact that he finds can convince. So
yes, the argument built around it.
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest that there are some people who would argue differently as to the particular fact, and this is what leads into some of the most serious crises.
Okay, so
including wars.
Remind me of your name?
David.
Okay, so David says you have one set of facts, two people argue the facts in different ways, draw different conclusions from it, and in and of itself, the fact and the argument is not going to determine your decision, where to stand. And I think there is a case to be made that where you stand is not based on the fact and argument, because as David says, you can construct different arguments with the same facts. It's not the facts and arguments, it's your predisposition or the coercive power of the other side's facts and arguments that you have to accept.
Which includes money power also.
Which includes money power. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to bring up like the Civil War. It just seems like a great example of this whole thing. You know, they had their own facts themselves. Like the South in general would have like these people claiming that what they were doing was justified, but you still had to go to war over it. So, I mean, you know, the North would try to can argue all day and present ration, but when it comes down to it, especially something as systematic as slavery was, that physical coercion was necessary to bring about change, and no amount of arguing was going to get around that fact.
Well, I would go further than you, actually, in the point that you made, because there's an erroneous assumption by people often on the left that their opponents on the right, I use these categories. Was that an alien coming down? There is since I'm a person of the left, I can speak with some knowledge of the topic. There's always an assumption by people of the left that people on the right, they have no arguments, that they're just stupid. And therefore, if ever it came to it, we could easily prevail in an argument. To take the case of the Civil War, the South had arguments, and the arguments weren't transparently wrong. Everything from the justice or the rightness of slavery, they could go all the way back and quote Aristotle. They had an intellectual tradition, actually a respectable intellectual tradition. I'm right now teaching in my other class, I'm teaching Thomas More's Utopia. And there are many aspects of Utopia which are quite inspiring. But there are slaves in Utopia. And he didn't think there was anything odd about including slaves in Utopia. So there's a very respectable intellectual tradition, the Western tradition, that justifies slavery. And they had arguments about property. And they had arguments about states' rights and the right to self-determination and their right to secede. Just as many parts of the world, there have been secessionist movements on the grounds of the right of self-determination. They had arguments. So it's not as if in the Civil War, one side had a monopoly of arguments and the other was ignorant but recalcitrant, ignorant but stubborn. No, that's not what happened. Both sides had arguments, and it was decided by force. It wasn't decided by, it was not decided by the strength of the argument. What is true is, as Mill says, and we'll get to it, what does happen is, once a question is decided by force, it then becomes part of the common sense, the instinct of humanity, which is to say, even though the South had arguments, and they had in fact persuasive arguments, once slaves were emancipated, it was unthinkable that we would ever go back. The arguments were over. Nobody makes those arguments anymore. So there is something to be said that for the fact that certain arguments become part of a society's common sense and they're no longer subject to dispute. There are large numbers of arguments why women shouldn't have the right to vote. The main argument, as I recall it, was, well, men are representing the interests of the women. We only need one person to represent both of their interests. And it was very persuasive at the time. It was. It took real political force to undo or chip away at that argument. However, now it's unthinkable that anyone would ever support depriving women of the right to suffrage. That can't happen. Look, horrible things can happen under our present head of state, and it is possible, we can't close our eyes to the possibility that I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it's impossible that there will be attempts to reverse Roe v. Wade and make abortion illegal again. I think it is a possibility. I think unlikely, but it's certainly a possibility. So yeah, horrible things can happen. I don't want to get into this because it becomes very complicated. But in the case of the abortion case, neither side can even come near to making a 100% persuasive case. It's just one of those borderline cases which is too ambiguous. Though, as I said, even slavery was, for its time, a case could be made. In the case of abortion, I do think it's intellectually much more problematic. It's impossible to argue. A good friend of mine whose political judgment I respect a lot, he said, the only way the abortion issue will ever be resolved is it's through technique or technology. There'll be a pill and it'll just be eliminated because intellectually, morally, you can't solve it. It's a dead end, and anyone who pretends, I think, otherwise is kidding him or herself. The arguments are just too complex, though I have to say it for the 10,000th time. The arguments for slavery were also very compelling. The arguments against a woman's right to suffrage, also very compelling. It's one of the naive and, I think, elitist assumptions of what's called the left, that they think they have a monopoly on all the good arguments and everybody on the other side is some sort of a hillbilly or deplorable. It's not true. It's not true. Yes?
Well, it's a lot to digest here. We've been discussing fact and argument as separate entities in the respect of coercion. You know, we're talking about persuading someone to come from one side to another, and fact and argument are not mutually exclusive. I feel like the last time we were here, we spent a lot of time discussing fact and truth as being the ultimate persuasive tool. I'm sorry, you want?
No, just
Can you hear me better now?
Closer, I think, sorry.
Yes, somebody wrote me, I'm glad you mentioned that, somebody wrote me that tell the students to keep the microphones closer to their mouth. Yeah.
We were discussing fact as the ultimate tool in coercion or persuasion when it comes to defining one's argument and creating a society based around these sets of arguments that are based on fact, when in actuality, argument in and of itself can stand alone. We can have a series of persuasive reasonings, whether or not they're based on fact, that can be enough to drive a societal force to, you know, define how how a group of people are.
The question there is whether you would call that argument.
Yes,
I mean,
I absolutely would call an unfactually based argument. It's still argument. And it's
well,
still persuasive and coercive.
You know, there's a point there. I do think, however, and maybe it's a personal thing. I think there is a difference between, I like to believe there's a difference between demagogy and a rational argument. Demagogy, I would not personally, when you appeal to if you're appealing solely and simply to a person's emotions and passions, sort of the classical Hitler type speaker, I couldn't grace that with the title of an argument. It's demagogy. It's trying to get people's emotions fired up to the point of a kind of psychosis.
I agree.
I can't call that an argument. Now, you could say, well, wasn't Martin Luther King doing the same thing? He was appealing to one's emotions, and there wasn't much there in the way of a rational, coherent argument. Let freedom ring. I don't know how to answer that. I think it's a tough question, and I think Malcolm X is an interesting case because he combines both. He definitely brings out a lot of passion, but he's also just, you listen to the arguments and you say, you know what, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense what he's saying. So it's a combination, I think, in his case. But I personally, obviously you can disagree, and a lot of people do disagree, but I couldn't call something that's constructed, from pure exciting, pure excitation of the emotions and passions. I couldn't call that an argument. That to me is not an argument.
I actually fully agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
And, in this highlighted passage, we're talking about a person who is capable of rectifying his mistakes by discussion and experience. Now, at what point does factual, provable evidence become discussion and experience? And at what point is discussion experience dismissed as not factual or not evidential, not something that can be supported? We had also discussed the last time we were here the parent-child relationship, and the childish representative, the one who was dependent on a societal upbringing, so to speak, is beholden to the opinions, whether or not they're supported by fact. I only maintain that the factual discussion.
There's an interesting argument there, because is it just a myth when we say after 18 people become adults and they're capable of reason, and therefore they're capable of making reasoned decisions, and that's why we leave them to their own devices? Is that just a myth, that they're actually acting after 18 on the basis of reason? Or maybe adults are just as childish as children and are as unsusceptible to reasoned argument as children. Cecilia, what do you say? In your experience, wrong opinions and practices gradually yield to fact and argument?
No, I will start it out by prefacing Yuri. When you say morality, I tend to think of morality as being subjective. I think we as humans, we possess that universal code. You could call it that Good Samaritan effect, whereby we see ourselves in other people. Joseph, you mentioned, the black coal workers, the white coal workers. They realize that their destinies are entwined, that they share a common destiny. So it's morally, if you could call it morally, because it's subjective, because they were looking at it from self-interest, but they realize that there is something bigger and greater and working towards that. And anything, usually when you think about that universal code, it kind of pushes you to compromise. You cannot get anything done without compromising.
I don't know, but I'm not convinced that's what happens.
You can't go it alone. No man is an island.
I'm not convinced that's what happens in the real world. A universal code sets in and convinces you to compromise. I look at too many situations that I've studied, and it doesn't convince me that that's how people change. I study the Israel-Palestine conflict. Yeah, one day Israelis may leave the occupied territories, but it's not going to be because of arguments. It's because they're going to decide it's no longer in their self-interest, time to pack up and leave. But the idea that they're going to be convinced by my arguments, it's not really believable, I think. One last person, because you two spoke already, so go ahead. Unless you, go ahead.
I was only going to say that after an argument's been framed and articulated, perhaps in a way that we wouldn't all be able to articulate it, I think things happen incrementally. You used slavery as an example, or emancipation, or women's suffrage. And I think what happens in the system is that you have one-off examples that we can kind of live with. I can kind of live with that, and then you see it somewhere else and it's a little bit more familiar, but I don't want that in my neighborhood. And that there's this sort of groundswell where an idea seeps in, is resisted, because that's a natural reaction to it. Then maybe on one-offs here or there, don't ask, don't tell. Well, at least he acknowledged, I mean, they're gay people, but we're not really going to talk about it. And then I think that once it's seeped in enough and there have been enough one-offs that you can rationalize or accept or live with, that group will acquire a voice and resistance sets in. And once it's reached a level of a resistance, well, this is just my view of the thing, then you have two things working simultaneously: incremental acceptance and very strenuous resistance.
Yeah, does everyone understand? I understand completely what you're saying. Basically, it's the critical mass theory of change. People see one example of a kind of behavior that they find really offensive and wrong. But they say, all right, they really want to do that, let them. Then you see a second example, a third example, and gradually there's a chipping away at your hardened position. And then at some point it reaches a critical mass. You see a lot of these things, and then, all right, let it go. And you accept it, and you just move on. I'm not, you lived through the women's movement of the 60s, I assume, did you?
Well, I'm a little bit younger than that, but I think the point is the voice of resistance, articulating and having a groundswell that says, I mean, Vietnam is a good example, with the peace marches and, maybe
there's always been a debate about the war in Vietnam, whether it was revulsion of what the U.S. was doing or whether it was the decision that it's costing too much and then let's just pack up our bags and get the hell out of here. I have to say, and I did live through it, and I was very active in the anti-war movement, as we called it back then. I have to say, with a certain amount of certitude, facts and argument had very little to do with why people came out against the war.
Well, the draft had a lot.
They said the draft had a lot, and there are elements that had a lot, but I didn't feel. I had one experience which is way too long. It would cause us to digress way too much. But during the war in Vietnam, there were several major actors. There was, of course, the United States. There was North Vietnam. There was South Vietnam. And the fourth major actor was this category of people who were called the Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong, we were told, were our enemy. And I remember several times, and also when I was teaching years later, I would do surveys. We all know the Viet Cong are the enemy. The Viet Cong are the enemy. And I would ask the students and my dorm mates when I was in college, and this was the height of the anti-war movement, the early 1970s, where masses of people already opposed the war. I would say, who are the Viet Cong? Are they North Vietnamese? Are they South Vietnamese? Are they both North and South Vietnamese? Or are they neither? I can tell you with absolute certitude, nobody ever knew the Viet Cong were South Vietnamese, because it was purposely contrived by our government to give these resistors to the government the title of Viet Cong, so nobody would know we're fighting the South Vietnamese, because the way the whole war was depicted in the United States was we're defending South Vietnam from North Vietnamese aggression, North Vietnamese communism. That's how it was depicted. Now that whole depiction collapses when you discover that the Viet Cong are South Vietnamese. And what does it mean we're defending South Vietnam if we're fighting Viet Cong and the Viet Cong are South Vietnamese? Nobody knew. So the most basic critical fact about the war, that our main enemy was the side we were supposedly defending, namely South Vietnam. The Viet Cong were South Vietnamese. Nobody knew. Nobody knew. So then how can it be plausibly argued that the anti-war position was based on facts and argument where people didn't even know the basic fact? Nobody knew. I really have to say, you know, if you were to say 2% of Americans knew, I would say that's an exaggeration.
I don't think anyone cared. I think
Yeah, well, that's important.
No one cared who they were fighting. What was happening is you had a draft and you lost 54,000 white people.
I mean, is that in college? I remember my professor saying that President Nixon at the time, he said we went looking for the enemy, and when we got there, we realized the enemy was us.
Well, that wasn't Nixon that said that.
LBJ? Well, I was like, okay.
Oh, you see your professor confused you. Okay, unless you two would like to say something else, either or both.
Well,
Microphone.
it seems that, it's okay.
We're good. No, because the 1 billion Chinese want to hear this.
I'm sure, but in this small room,
But it's being taped. Because the Chinese Central Committee requested that we take these classes on liberty.
But I think it's useful in this whole discussion from the beginning to the end to consider this fashion. The way fashions sweep a country, all kinds of people, border to border, but something like fashions, which are, there's no buildup of a critical mass, it seeps in and people just do it. One theory I know is the human organism is alive, but as a social organism, and that it transmits ideas, it transmits arguments, it transmits politics,
What is it?
passions, and everything else, but in the way the brains of humans are, they pick it up in very mysterious ways. I don't think we understand it yet, and I think it's probably understandable, but we're still far ahead of us.
Okay. Let's now turn, in the time that remains, I want to look at his last argument, not so much for freedom of speech as his argument for individuality, why he thinks we must protect not just liberty of speech, but liberty of conduct, individuality. And this appears, let's see, this will be easy for Yella. All you have to do is enter the word, well, no, I know yoke appears, okay, intoxicated. Good. Yella, you have a future. He's worried about whether he completes his doctoral dissertation, as does every doctoral candidate. And here I am to comfort you. If you don't complete the dissertation, I see an altogether different future for you.
Your assistant?
Yes. The usurper starts out as the assistant. So, you had it?
Yeah.
I don't know where you want to start.
Yeah, well, I'd like to start at the progressive principle. It was just a little bit above, yes. And we're going to go, it's a long passage, but well worth the time. We're going to go down to many-sided development.
Further down?
Yes, it's going to go.
Well, let's stay here for now.
Yes. Okay, I don't want to exercise you too much. You're still young, which means I should be able to exercise you. Okay, the progressive principle, meaning how progress unfolds. The progressive principle, skipping a little, is antagonistic, is in conflict to the sway of custom, involving at least emancipation from that yoke. In order for progress to occur, we have to free ourselves, emancipate ourselves from the yoke, the shackle of custom. And the contest between the two, namely progress and custom, the contest between the two constitutes the chief interest of the history of mankind, which is a very tall statement coming from John Stuart, J.S. Mill. He says the key to understanding the unfolding of history is this contest, this conflict between progress on the one hand and custom on the other. The greater part of the world has, properly speaking, no history, because the despotism of custom is complete. For Mill, history means change, progress. And if custom is exercising a despotic, a tyrannical sway over society, then there's no history. A society can physically endure for millennia, but if there's no change, it doesn't have, properly speaking, says Mill, a history, because for Mill, history means change. It has to be some sort of demonstrable, palpable evolution or change for something to constitute history. So, if you are as a person exactly as you were 30 years ago, no accumulation of knowledge, no accumulation of opinions, no change at all, it's hard to say that you have grown very much. And the same way, if there's no change in a society, it has, for Mill, no history. And he says most of the world, and here he's referring, some will say, because he is Eurocentric, a label which I consider wholly irrelevant. Importance is the argument, not the label you pin on it. He says the greater part of the world has properly no history because the despotism of custom is complete. This is the case over the whole East, which he's referring now to everything east of Europe. He's referring to India and China and all the rest. This is the case over the whole East. Custom is there in all things the final appeal. Justice and right mean conformity to custom. The argument of custom no one, unless some tyrant intoxicated with power, thinks of resisting. In all these huge swaths of humanity, says Mill, everything is decided, everything is regulated by custom. That if you propose a change, you are immediately defeated by the argument it violates custom. Custom is the final appeal. And so long as that's the case, says Mill, they have no history. And then Mill says, and we see the result. These nations, or those nations, must once have had originality. They did not start out of the ground populous, lettered, and versed in many of the arts of life. He says, look at Chinese civilization, look at Indian civilization. They must, at some point, have had some originality because these were great civilizations. They made themselves all this and were then the greatest and most powerful nations in the world. China, India, these were great civilizations. But then Mill asks, speaking in the 19th century, what are they now? The subjects or dependents of tribes whose forefathers wandered in the forests when theirs had magnificent palaces and gorgeous temples, but over whom custom exercised only a divided rule with liberty and progress. What is he saying there? Anyone, look at it closely, who can translate it? Not easy, but it's not impossible or impenetrable either. What are they now? They're the subjects or dependents of tribes whose forefathers wandered in the forests when theirs had magnificent palaces and gorgeous temples, but over whom custom exercised only a divided rule with liberty and progress. Who wants to figure out what's he saying there?
I don't know if but what he's saying, I mean, he's just being very negative, but obviously I got to respect the argument, not just, he's saying that it's because of custom that they fell. I don't agree with that statement, but that's what he is saying.
But who is he referring to?
Well, I guess he's talking about the Chinese and the Indian.
No, but who is he saying? What are they now? The subjects or dependents of tribes whose forefathers wandered in the forest when theirs had magnificent palaces and gorgeous temples, but over whom custom exercised only a divided rule with liberty and progress. What's he saying there? Okay, because of reasons of time, I'll explain it. He's saying Europe, when there were these magnificent civilizations in China and India, Europe, he says, it consisted just of tribes wandering in the forests. At the time of these magnificent civilizations, Europe was so backward, so barbarian. And he said, now Europe has turned these formerly magnificent civilizations into subjects and dependents. So he's not making a racist argument here. He's acknowledging that they produced great civilizations, but now they are the subjects or dependents of people who were barbarians when they were thriving in their civilizations. He says the reason Europe was able to advance, the reason it was able to advance is because custom exercised only a divided rule. Custom did not decide everything in Europe. A people, it appears, may be progressive for a certain length of time, like the Chinese and the Indians, and then stop dead in its tracks. When does it stop? And here comes Mill's argument. Why do civilizations cease to develop? And Mill has a very simple, and we have to decide for ourselves how compelling, a simple answer. When do civilizations stop developing? When they cease to possess individuality. When they cease to possess individuality. And then he says, skipping a little, we have a warning example in China. Do you see it? Let's go down. Enter warning. W-A-R-N-I-N-G. Warning. Okay. We have a warning example in China, a nation of much talent, and in some respects, even wisdom, owing to the rare good fortune of having been provided, here meaning China, having been provided at an early period with a particularly good set of customs, the work in some measure of men to whom even the most enlightened Europeans must accord, under certain limitations, the title of sages and philosophers. He's talking about people like Confucius. They, meaning the Chinese, are remarkable too in the excellence of their apparatus for impressing as far as possible the best wisdom they possess upon every mind in the community, and securing that those who have appropriated most of it shall occupy the posts of honor and power. Basically, he's saying the Chinese had a very impressive set of customs, they had a very effective educational system, and they had an effective method of making sure that the most talented people in their society ended up in the most responsible posts and positions. They had a very efficient system of plucking out talent and then making sure that the responsible positions in society are occupied by those with talent and ability. Surely the people who did this have discovered the secret of human progressiveness and must have kept themselves steadily at the head of the movement of the world. On the contrary...
Now, your attention please. Central Library will be closing in 15 minutes. If you have any reference materials to return, please do so at this time. If you would like to check out any materials, please join the checkout line now. I repeat, Central Library will be closing in 15 minutes.
On the contrary, he says, they have become stationary. China has come to a standstill and have remained so for thousands of years. And if they are ever to be farther improved, it must be by foreigners. Now skip to hitherto. Got it? What is it that hitherto? Good. What is it that has hitherto preserved Europe from this lot? What has prevented Europe from stopping to develop? Why does it continue to evolve? Why is it not stationary? And his answer is their remarkable diversity of character and culture. Individuals, classes, nations have been extremely unlike one another. They have struck out a great variety of paths, each leading to something valuable. Europe, skipping a little, Europe is, skip down to in plurality. Europe is, in my judgment, wholly indebted to this plurality of paths for its progress and many-sided development. So, Mill's making a very sweeping judgment. Keep in mind, Mill, and I'm not saying this in praise of John Stuart Mill, it's simply a fact to the extent that facts speak for themselves. Mill had a colossal mind and a capacious grasp of history, philosophy, all departments of human intellect. And here he takes this mass of wisdom and he condenses and compresses it in one succinct and simple proposition. It's very succinct and simple. He says, what accounts for human progress? He says the answer is very simple. Plurality of paths, what we call nowadays, what's the word we use?
Diversity.
Yes, diversity. It's diversity that is the engine of human progress. It's diversity that is it's the locomotive of history. Diversity. Now, it's kind of breathtaking, you have to say, because you have to ask yourself, can it really be that simple? Karl Marx, as some of you will know, famously says his Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. He says the engine, the locomotive of history is the struggle between classes. Mill has a totally different opinion. What's the engine of history? What enables history? Mill says it's diversity. Very simple answer. But then you ask yourself the question, which we're going to be discussing at some length beginning next week, beginning in a few weeks, because next week we begin with freedom of speech. You ask yourself the question, what makes New York, our city, such a dynamic city? Why is it a magnet from people all around the world? What is it about New York that draws to it as no other city, I think, on earth does? People from every corner of the planet. And what is to account for its energy, its power? Is it too simple to say its innovativeness, its allure, its attractiveness,
May I have your attention, please?
its
Central Library will
appeal?
be closing in 10 minutes.
Is it too simple to say that it is its diversity? Is it too simple to say that? Or to put it differently, is there really on earth a dynamic city that lacks diversity? If you've been to London, London is like New York. It's just as diverse as if you walk the streets of New York. And it's very hard, I think. I've traveled a lot, but I've not stayed very long wherever I've traveled. It's usually just the airport, the hotel, the lecture hall, and home, so I have to be honest about that. But it's hard to think of a dynamic, exciting, appealing city that is homogeneous. Now maybe Tokyo is, I'm not sure. Tokyo's for sure homogeneous. Does it have the energy of New York? I don't know. Well, we have just a few minutes because I have to give you a kind of an assignment for next week. But anyone wish to comment on Mill's proposition? So if you don't mind, I'm going to just ask Yella, who's now steeped in his graduate studies at the European University in Venice with the top scholars and minds in the world. Do you think, Yella, that all of the essence of human history can be captured in this simple formula? Europe is, in my judgment, wholly indebted to this plurality of paths for its progressive and many-sided development. Can it be reduced to that?
No. Very intelligent comment.
Okay, next. Well, what's wrong with it? No, you don't get away with that either. What's wrong with that?
Because it leaves out wholly, I'm using the word wholly because it leaves out completely any analysis of power and I mean, there's always diversity in many places in the world, but can you really imagine thinking of, let's say, a European city that I know, Amsterdam or Paris, the diversity, i.e. all the people of Arab descent living in poverty in the suburbs, contributing in any sense to its power or dynamism? I don't see that argument.
Okay, argument number one, Yella says, okay, Paris is diverse. It has a significant Arab Muslim population, but they just live in impoverished circumstances in the districts surrounding the city. They have nothing really to do with Paris's prominence on the world map. So diversity in and of itself, says Yella, doesn't really explain anything. You have to also talk about the distribution, for example, of power. They are powerless. But even there, Yella, I don't want to get into a long discussion of this because time doesn't allow. It is true, however, to say, since yesterday, the king or the founder of rock and roll, Chuck Berry, passed away, that were it not for the diversity of our culture, the diversity which included and includes a poor mass of non-white people.
May I have your attention, please? Central Library will be closing in 5 minutes.
We wouldn't have had jazz. We wouldn't have had rock and roll. We wouldn't have had many things which contributed significantly to our culture and world culture. And if we have them, even if they were impoverished and powerless, if we have those contributions, it is because of diversity. You can't get around that. It is because of diversity. They may have been impoverished, African Americans who pioneered jazz and rock and roll. They may have been impoverished, they may have been powerless, but by virtue of having a diverse stratum of humanity, it did contribute a lot to our society. And can you really, it's said, I don't know how true it is, but it's often said, and Albert will know better than I do, but it's often said of the Chinese, even today, as they stand in the cutting edge of world capitalism, even today it's said that they're very weak in the areas of originality. They are strong in the area of copying. And the educational system is still very rote. It's very mechanical. Many people are still, to this day, they're amazed at the American classroom because of its democratic nature, the discussion, the interaction, and all of that. It just doesn't go on anywhere else. Now, I'm not a patriot, as all of you know. The Star Spangled Banner is not on my repertoire. The Internationale is. But facts are, facts are facts. The kind of democratic, lively, diverse discussion that's permissible in the American classroom is just very unusual, even in the world, even in Europe, to allow students to have and express their different opinions. And I have to believe that contributes something to our scientific technological edge. Am I wrong?
Oh, you're right.
I agree with that.
You're right. Amen.
Okay,
You're saying something, which is not the same as Mill, which says it's the main engine of. I mean, poverty creates great culture as well. It's not an argument for poverty.
It's not an argument for poverty. It's a fact If Vincent van Gogh had not been psychologically tormented, he wouldn't have produced his art. Does that mean we would wish torment on him? No, but it is a fact that the torment produced it.